Good morning. I'm Dave Clennon. I am your facilitator this morning. Member of ICUJP, member of the ICUJP Board of Directors, also a member of Jewish Voice for Peace, and the Cultural and Academic Boycott of Israel.
It is a good time again, and I'm glad to announce the September 10, 2023 annual George Regas Courageous Peacemaker Awards. This will be held, Randy, at All Saints Church. We're very proud of that. Among the honorees is All Saints Church for its work to combat houselessness. And another honoree is right here on our screen, Anthony Manousis and Jill Shook, because the theme of this year's program is housing is a human right. So please save Sunday, September 10, at 1 o'clock or a little later in the afternoon. Rick and I are putting together a save the date plus an announcement. We have several surprises to announce. It'll be a meaningful program, our first return to an fully in-person event since COVID. And we really do hope every one of you can join us to honor George Regas's memory, his struggle for peace and justice, the work of ICUJP, and these wonderful honorees. Thank you.
I would like to ask Anthony to give us a reflection this morning before we introduce Sonia.
Thanks, Dave. Well, I'm going to be speaking about Oppenheimer, and I was really drawn to the movie for a lot of reasons, one of which is I grew up in Princeton, and a lot of the scenes in Oppenheimer are shot at the Institute of Advanced Study, and it brought back some memories. So I'm calling this reflection the power of the peace movement versus the folly of scientists. This week, Jill and I went to see Oppenheimer with some friends and were deeply moved by its complex portrayal of the father of the atomic bomb. Oppenheimer's story is profoundly tragic, as most war stories are. He is portrayed with all his ambiguity, brilliant, full of hubris, and morally conflicted. He realizes too late that he has released the genie of mass destruction from its bottle, and his efforts to curtail the consequences of this act of hubris lead to his political downfall. The movie assumes that the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a necessary evil to end the war with Japan and saved countless lives. This claim has been disputed by revisionist historians like Gar Alperowitz, author of The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb, and Martin Sherwin, author of Gambling with Armageddon, Nuclear Roulette from Hiroshima to the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 2020, these historians wrote an op-ed piece in the LA Times showing that even the military questioned the necessity of using the atomic bomb on Japan. The National Museum of the US Navy in Washington, D.C. states unambiguously on a plaque with its atomic bomb exhibit, quote, "The vast destruction wreaked by the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the loss of 135,000 people made little impact on the Japanese military. However, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria changed their minds," unquote. Furthermore, the authors point out that 7 of the United States' 8 five-star Army and Navy officers in 1945 agreed with the Navy's vitriolic assessment. Generals Dwight Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur, Henry Hap Arnold, and Admirals William Leahy, Chester Nimitz, Ernest King, and William Halsey are on record stating that the atomic bombs were either militarily unnecessary, morally reprehensible, or both. What the movie portrays instead is the frenzied jubilation of most Americans when they learned that the atomic bomb had been dropped on the Japanese, who surrendered the next day. In a dramatic scene, Oppenheimer boasts that the bomb has been dropped on the Japanese and should have been dropped on the Germans, and everyone applauds wildly. During the deafening and uncontrollable applause, Oppenheimer has a horrific vision of the room consumed with atomic fire. This ambivalence is what makes Oppenheimer a tragic figure and the movie worth watching. The movie ends on an apocalyptic note, with Oppenheimer realizing that he started an arms race that could lead to the destruction of all life on the planet. The power of the atomic bomb is seen as godlike through the eyes of Oppenheimer and also the filmmaker, Christopher Nolan. In a best-selling biography of Oppenheimer, Carl K. Bird and Martin Sherwin compare him to Prometheus, the Greek god who gave humans fire and was punished by Zeus by being chained to a rock and tortured for eternity. Oppenheimer names the first atomic test Trinity in reference to a poem by John Donne called Batter My Heart, Three-Person God. When Oppenheimer witnessed the awesome power of the atomic bomb, he recalled a line from his favorite scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. In reality, Oppenheimer is all too human. His efforts to prevent the US from building hydrogen bombs proved ineffective. He never expressed regret for having developed the atomic bomb or its use against Japan. And rather than consistently oppose the red baiting of the late 40s and 50s, Oppenheimer testified against former colleagues and students before and during his hearing. He symbolized for many the folly of scientists who believed that they could control the use of their research and the dilemmas of moral responsibility presented by science in the nuclear age. I'd like to contrast this tragic and morally ambiguous story with that of the unsung heroes of the peace movement who helped to end the Cold War and reverse the arms race. I'm thinking of Albert Bigelow, a naval commander who had a change of heart after he went to Hiroshima and witnessed the devastation caused by the atomic bomb. He quit the Navy a month before being eligible for a pension, joined the peace movement, and became a Quaker. In 1958, he set sail in a boat aptly named the Golden Rule, with the intention of entering the nuclear test site in the Marshall Islands. He and his crew were arrested in Hawaii, but his action inspired others like Carl and Barbara Reynolds and Greenpeace. What a great movie his life story would make. The American Friends Service Committee and the Quakers began reaching out to the Soviets in the early 50s to build trust and dispel stereotypes with the hope of ending the Cold War. They persisted in this effort for the next 30-some years, and in the 1980s, their efforts bore fruit. When Gorbachev came to power, he wanted to end the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. Reagan was a staunch anti-communist and Cold Warrior, but he was willing to meet with Gorbachev, thanks in part to pressure from the peace movement. The nuclear freeze movement not only garnered the support of most American peace organizations, but was also endorsed by numerous public leaders, intellectuals, and activists. Former public officials such as George Ball, Clark Clifford, William Colby, Averell Harriman, and George Kennan spoke out in favor of a nuclear freeze. Support also came from leading scientists, including Linus Pauling, Jerome Weiser, Bernard Feld, and Carl Sagan. Reagan was also influenced by the citizen diplomacy movement, of which I was a part. Because of Glasnost, Gorbachev's policy of openness, thousands of Americans went to the Soviet Union to meet the Russians, build relationships, and advocate for peace. This had a profound impact on Reagan and Gorbachev. They eventually met at the Reykjavik summit in October 1986 and came very close to agreeing to ban all nuclear weapons by 2000. Both men wanted nuclear abolition, but the American generals persuaded Reagan not to go that far. While Reagan and Gorbachev didn't ban all nuclear weapons, their meeting paved the way for the 1987 Intermediate Range Force Treaty and the 1991 Strategic Offensive Arms Reductions Treaty, as well as limitations on nuclear testing. There were over 60,000 nuclear weapons in the world in 1980s, and today there are 12,500. Far, far too many, but this reduction would not have happened without the peace movement. Hollywood buys into the myth that great men are the ones who make history. But I believe that lasting and positive change usually happens at the grassroots. I agree with Margaret Mead, who famously said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." We at ICUJP are such a group, and we shouldn't underestimate our power. Around the world, there are thousands of groups like ours working for peace. Our efforts are generally not reported in the media or portrayed in movies, but we are nonetheless influential. I believe that with God's help, we can change the world for the better. We just need to be persistent, passionate, and prophetic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you, Anthony.
Way to go, Anthony.
Thank you for that history and for the optimism about the possibility that we can end this nuclear threat that hangs over all of our heads. So Anthony, I think we are ready to ask you to introduce our guest this morning.
Well, it's my pleasure. I've known Sonia Tuma for nearly 30 years, since coming to California and serving on an AFSC board in Pasadena during the time when Ched Myers was the regional director. And at that time, Sonia worked for the AFSC on the Middle East program. As she said earlier, she's currently the Associate General Secretary for Global Cohesion at the American Friends Service Committee. And in that role, she leads the organization in threading together AFSC's global work on peace and justice in 18 countries towards greater collective impact. Sonia's career includes community organizing, the development and delivery of educational programming, advocacy work on local and national levels, and at the UN. She has an academic background in international relations with special focus on political economy and the interplay between nationalism and the feminist movements. And Sonia recently gave a very impressive presentation at Orange Grove meeting about becoming an apartheid-free community. And I hope that we at ICUJP can join this campaign after we hear more about it.
Thank you, Anthony. Sonia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Anthony, for the introduction, and everybody else for your introductions earlier this morning. It's good to see you, especially good to see Daryl, who I have not seen in many, many years. Actually, I worked on Middle East issues in Los Angeles with Daryl quite a long time ago. So hi, Daryl.
Good to see you. Hey.
I am going to, as I said earlier, I'm going to set a timer because I am sort of notoriously bad for paying attention to that. So I'll introduce myself. I've got a pretty long slide deck to share with you. Some of them I'll go through briefly. I'm going to show a video as part of that slide deck that really talks about the sort of the framing that I'm going to use this morning, which is really looking at the behavior of the Israeli government as an apartheid state. That's really the framing for the conversation this morning. So a little bit about myself, just kind of as an introduction. Actually, I will pull the PowerPoint up because it'll help guide me through what I'm going to say here and keep me on track. So you just start that and make sure. Can somebody affirm that you can see the slides? Great. So I'm going to talk about the Apartheid-Free Communities campaign especially the congregational aspect of it. So I'll talk a little more about that as I go today. So I think I've spoken to this group before, actually. Several years ago, I talked about work in the western part of the United States that AFSC does in different kinds of communities and our social justice work. And at that point, I really did focus on our work in the US. And you have several Quakers among you this morning. So I imagine the Quaker Youth Universe, Quakerverse is a known one to this group. But AFSC, just so you know, is a 106-year-old now Quaker peace and social justice organization that really promotes a world free of violence, inequality, and oppression. And we are a faith-based organization, really guided by this fundamental belief that the divine light lives within each person, and that we need to nurture the seeds of peace and the potential for change in every person, for everyone's ability to transform societies and institutions. And I think Anthony's comments during his reflection about the role of small groups and peace movements around the world is really kind of in some ways a sort of bedrock around how AFSC has worked. And I'm always proud to mention that the AFSC was the co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1947, along with British Quakers. So that's a little bit about AFSC. And just a sort of little bit about me. So I was born and raised in Los Angeles, lived lots of other places, but have been back here now 11 years. And I came to the American Friends Service Committee to do work on Middle East issues, in particular Palestine, but also Iraq, which is where my part of my family background is. So a little personal introduction for me. I have, as I said, I'm first generation American. My parents, my mom was an Eastern European Jew. She was born here. Her parents were immigrants from what is now Belarus, and my father was an Iraqi Muslim. And so I grew up in the context of the sort of Arab-Jewish dialogue and dilemma, very clearly played out in my home, in my family. And I'll say I grew to work on Palestine because I found an interest in it. Even though I grew up in a home and in a family where it was something we explicitly did not talk about, and we didn't talk about it, I think, partly as a way to do the thing that many of us are really prone to do, which is to find the things that we have in common and focus on those things, as opposed to find the places where we are going to have discord. And so I found the issue of Palestine and the question around the role of the State of Israel and the implications of what that meant for Palestinians as a student. And it, I was a young person who was really interested in a lot of justice issues, and I found this issue and it felt incredibly compelling and in many ways very personal to me. Still does, many years later. So I worked on Middle East issues, as I said, for quite a long time. I ran the program that Anthony referred to, AFSC's Middle East Peace Education Program in Los Angeles. I ran that program for about 8 years. Before that, I was with an organization in the Bay Area called Middle East Children's Alliance, and did a lot of work on Palestine, did a lot of work related to Iraq and the US war against Iraq, and the US and UN imposed sanctions against Iraq, the impact of those sanctions. So I have this background, and as it indicates in my bio, I have also a real interest in and some background in the interplay between feminist movements and nationalist movements. What happens to women and feminist movements during war and times of conflict? So that's a little bit about who I am. I have, for the last probably 20 years or so, I have done more kind of administrative and leadership work inside the AFSC, trying to help do strategic planning, move our programs to have as great an impact as they can. My heart is still very much in this work, and I am back about 2 months now from having participated in a delegation of faith leaders from 10 different denominations who took a trip to Israel and Palestine and met with different kinds of communities and different community leaders to look at what is happening today in Israel and in Palestine in relation to this question of apartheid. So, so just a little bit about how I'm going to frame today's conversation. I'm going to talk about what is apartheid, and how does it actually, what's the legal definition of it? How does it relate to talking about what's happened in Israel? Generally speaking, people think of apartheid and they think about South Africa. That is the example that lives in people's head when we talk about apartheid. And there's a lot of kind of anxiousness about moving that definition to look at Israel. But I'm going to talk with you about why. I'm going to show you a video that is about 12 minutes long that really explains it. And then I'm going to talk about the campaign, the Apartheid-Free campaign, with an ask that you, as ICUJP, and that the congregations that you work with consider taking the pledge to be an apartheid-free community or apartheid-free congregation. Talk a little bit about what that actually means, and then leave some time for questions at the end. So that's how we'll frame today's conversation. So I am going to start by showing a video. And this video is really talking about, it frames for us what apartheid is and why what we're talking about here is apartheid. So I'm going to start that video now.
Many people think of Israel and Palestine as two countries at war, with this one, a state for Jewish people, occupying this one here, where Palestinians live. The truth is, both Israeli Jews and Palestinians live all over this territory, ruled by one government and one army, based on the idea of
advancing the supremacy and domination of one group of people, Jews.
And that is what guides its policies and its practices towards Palestinians.
In other words, apartheid. Apartheid is a loaded word tied to the racist South African regime of white minority rule. But although the word comes from there, apartheid isn't just a description of what happened in South Africa. It's actually a crime against humanity under international law. In 2021, Human Rights Watch accused Israel of carrying out apartheid. It based this accusation on the 1973 Apartheid Convention and the 1998 Rome Statute, which say that 3 elements have to occur for the crime of apartheid to apply. They are an intent by one group to dominate the other, systematic oppression by one racial group over another, and one or more inhumane acts, like denying people the right to leave and to return to their country, expropriation of landed property, and the creation of separate reserves and ghettos. So let's see if any of these apply to Israel's rule over Palestinians.
About half of the people that live here under Israel's rule are Palestinian, and the other half are Jews, like myself.
For those 7 million Israeli Jews, almost the entire land is one space. Whether they're here, 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 or here, they have the same rights, privileges, and legal status. They can move freely, vote in the same elections, and live under the same laws. The boundaries are invisible to them. But for the 7 million Palestinians, the boundaries are very visible. Whereas this is essentially one space for Israelis, Palestinians have been divided into 4 areas. Each area gets a different colored ID card issued by Israel, and your life and rights are determined by that ID card. In Gaza, Palestinians have no freedom of movement and are under a complete Israeli blockade. Israel no longer has soldiers inside Gaza, but it controls every aspect of life from the outside. People in Gaza have no civil or political rights. They've got no say in the Israeli government that controls them. Palestinians in the West Bank also have very limited freedom of movement, with their population divided into 165 disconnected cantons, cut off by Israeli military checkpoints, walls, settlements, and other infrastructure. They also have no civil or political rights in Israel. In East Jerusalem, Palestinians generally have more freedom to move, but Israel can take away their right to live in the city. They can't vote in Israeli elections, and Israel also bars them from taking part in Palestinian politics. Palestinians who are citizens of Israel can travel relatively freely, but they face restrictions on where they can live. They can vote in Israeli elections, but face legalized discrimination. Yara Hawadi is a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship.
This ID system, it penetrates, all areas of life, where you live, where you study, what you work, etc. Even the more intimate areas of life, such as who you marry.
That's because for the most part, a Palestinian can't pass on their ID status to their spouse.
And this has huge implications on where they can live. Many indeed actually end up leaving and choosing to live abroad because it is that difficult.
On rare occasions, Palestinians are able to change their ID, but only in one direction.
So for instance, if a Palestinian from East Jerusalem moves somewhere else inside the West Bank, they could lose their residency in East Jerusalem. And Israel, since it's considered that a downgrade, then that's a direction that would be feasible. And further down the line, again, from Israel's perspective, if West Bankers move to the Gaza Strip, then that's a direction that Israel will accept, but not in the opposite direction.
So while Palestinians are granted different rights based on their IDs, nowhere do those rights match those of Israeli Jews. Looks like we can check off at least one of the elements required for apartheid to apply. When Israel was founded in 1948, 700,000 Palestinians had fled or been forced out. The result was that the new state had a Jewish majority. To maintain that majority, Israel has never allowed the refugees to return. The Palestinians who remained were given Israeli citizenship, although they were kept under strict military rule for 19 years. But in 1967, when Israel occupied more lands, including Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, it faced a problem. It wanted the land, but didn't want the Palestinians on that land. So it's refused to extend citizenship to the rest of the Palestinians under its control, while keeping them under military rule ever since. To further control the ratio of Palestinians to Israeli Jews, Israel still bans Palestinian refugees and their descendants from moving into any of the territories it controls, while encouraging any Jewish person anywhere in the world to immigrate to Israel, even if they've never set foot there before. In Jerusalem, the Israeli authorities actually have a population target: 60% Jews to 40% Palestinians. Palestinians in Jerusalem are only granted a permanent residency permit, even if they've been living in the city since before Israel was founded.
About 350,000 Palestinians are in that status, and which is Orwellian the way it's defined, because the only thing permanent in permanent residency is that it can actually always be taken away.
These permits can be revoked if a Palestinian moves out of the city, but Jewish Israelis living in Jerusalem never lose residency, even if they move to the other side of the world. This discrimination has been enshrined in Israeli law. The 2018 Nationstate law says that Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people, and that the right to national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. That means that even Palestinians with Israeli citizenship aren't considered equal to Jews with Israeli citizenship. As Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu put it, Israel is not a state of all its citizens, but rather the nation-state of the Jewish people, and only them. So let's go back to that list from before. The nation-state law is only one of many Israeli laws that explicitly discriminate against Palestinians. For example, there's the 1950 absentees property law. Deeming Palestinian refugees absentees, Israel seized hundreds of thousands of acres of their land, even though they were only absent because Israel wouldn't let them return. Remember, denying people the right to return to their country is on the list of inhumane acts that legally make up the third element of apartheid. There are more Israeli policies that could fall under the category of inhumane acts, especially when it comes to land.
So Israel desires the land, even more so desires empty land, or land that it makes empty, and doesn't desire the Palestinians living on that land. And that has resulted in policies in which land is constantly moving in one direction. Land that used to be Palestinian becomes state land, and then that land is allocated for the development of towns and communities for Jewish citizens.
And yes, expropriation of land is also an inhumane act. So let's see what that looks like on the ground. Across the entire territory, Palestinian communities are overcrowded and surrounded by Jewish-only communities.
It's the same type of practice of encircling Palestinian communities so that they can't expand, cutting them off from one another. It's a continuous practice that began in 1948 and was expanded to the West Bank in 1967.
The Israeli state prioritizes Jewish development in places where it wants to restrict the growth of Palestinian communities, with the government keen to Judaize areas like the Galilee and the Negev.
Israeli politicians frequently use that term to Judaize an area, in other words, to ensure Israeli Jewish dominance in a particular area, where the government has a concern over the Palestinian demography. And in any other context, this would be condemned as, gross ethnic engineering. It's in its basic laws, which is essentially the Israeli constitution. The land is deemed for the Jewish people, not the Israeli people, but the Jewish people.
In fact, only 3% of the land inside Israel's 1948 borders is allocated for its Palestinian citizens. Meanwhile, hundreds of new communities have been built for its Jewish citizens, many on the ruins of destroyed Palestinian villages. Plus, there's the 200 illegal Jewish settlements that have been built across the West Bank as well. At the same time, thousands of Palestinian homes have been demolished or are under threat of demolition, having been built without permits because Israel rejects most Palestinian building applications. Meanwhile, in the Negev Desert, the Israeli government wants to maximize the land available for Jewish development. So it has tried to force Palestinian Bedouin citizens into small townships by demolishing their homes and not allowing them to connect to the water and power grids. One village, El Araqib, has been demolished more than 180 times.
Now, just across the Green Line, a similar struggle is taking place in the village of Sucia, which is in the West Bank, just south of Hebron. And it too has faced a series of mass demolitions by authorities in an attempt to establish Israeli Jewish control over the area.
Looks like we can check off another one of the criteria for apartheid. Israel has total control of this entire territory. Even in Gaza and the West Bank, which have some limited autonomous Palestinian administration in place, Israel controls the borders, trade, resources, water, electricity, the airspace, the electromagnetic spectrum, the population registry, and more. Accusing a government of carrying out a crime against humanity like apartheid is no simple matter. But we've seen how Israel's control over and discrimination against Palestinians fits the legal threshold for apartheid. Israel's own leaders knew this was happening, although they didn't do much to stop it.
The state that you have at the moment is an apartheid state, isn't it?
It's not yet apartheid, but it might come on this slippery slope toward apartheid.
Still, how could apartheid apply to Israel when, say, Palestinian citizens can vote?
So, as a Palestinian citizen of Israel, I cannot question the fundamental constitution of Israel, which says that the state is for the Jewish people and the Jewish people alone. My citizenship doesn't allow for inclusion in that state, and so therefore participation in Israeli elections or in the Knesset is really nominal and has no potential to change policy.
Another argument against the accusation of apartheid is that the occupation is only temporary, and when it ends, Palestinians will rule themselves.
Normal people don't think that 54 years is temporary. We've passed that line already a very long time ago. And yeah, there's a lot of Israeli propaganda insisting on that worldview of democracy plus temporary occupation. No, it's not a democracy and it's not a temporary occupation. It's one regime between the river and the sea, and that regime is apartheid.
So I'm going to keep going forward with the slide deck, and then we'll have time to talk more about the concepts a little bit later. So let's see. So what the video did was point out these three facets of apartheid. So apartheid is a legal framework under international law. And in 1998, the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court named it. In 1973, the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid defined apartheid as having those three components which are laid out in the video: an intent to maintain domination by one racial group over another, a context of systemic oppression, and carrying out of inhumane acts. So this notion of intent to maintain domination, if you look at the demographic information, you can see that there are sort of roughly equal numbers of Palestinians and Jewish Israelis living inside the context of Israel and Palestine. And as the video showed, Jewish Israelis are free to live throughout Israel, East Jerusalem, and most of the West Bank. Just to say, there are 700,000 settlers currently living inside the West Bank. The number has grown over and over again. And there are a roughly equal number of Palestinians living in a considerably smaller amount of territory. And there are Palestinian Israelis who are on about 3% of the land inside Israel, and barred effectively from living in Jewish towns in Israel. Then inside East Jerusalem, Israel guarantees residency rights to Jewish Israelis, but for Palestinians, residency is conditional and revocable. I did note that the quote from the director of B'Tselem, who said the only thing permanent about permanent residency is the ability to take it away. It can always be taken away, as opposed to citizenship. So, and then in the folks who are living in the West Bank, Palestinians who are living in the West Bank are barred effectively from building in much of the West Bank. There are very controlled areas of the West Bank where Palestinians can live. Getting building permits to build in those places is very difficult. And as I said, an increasing number of Israeli settlements. And then folks who live in Gaza, Palestinians in Gaza, who are essentially living in an open air prison that is completely controlled by Israel. And then this question around particular statements that have been made. So let me just move this out of the way here. There's some quotes here really about this notion, this sort of intention to Judaize more and more parts of the country. This idea that Palestinians will remain subjects of the Israeli government as opposed to participants in the democracy of Israel, and the notion that of fear, of concern that the Arab population will grow within Jerusalem and that it will grow generally in places that inside the Green Line inside Israel. And in 2005, pulled out of Gaza entirely, and growing concern around the occupation of land, the use of land by Bedouins in the Negev. So I'm going to just stop here briefly and tell you, as I said, I'm back a couple of months now from having been a part of this delegation. And one of the things that happened on this delegation was that we met with a number of people, including a Bedouin family, as was mentioned, a village that was mentioned in the video, Al-Araqib in the Negev, or the Negev, which we met with those folks whose entire village, essentially the homes inside it, all the structures inside it, have been destroyed more than 180 times. Their crops have been sprayed with pesticides, aerial spraying of pesticides. They are citizens of Israel. They live inside Israel, but they get no services from the government and are continually harassed and pushed onto smaller and smaller pieces of land. So that first definition of apartheid, intent to maintain domination. The second, systemic oppression. So this is really about domination and occupation, and looking at the annexation of land by Israel, looking at Israeli subjects of Palestinian law, and who are governed by military control. So one thing to know, one of the folks that we met with, there's a teenage boy who was a student at the Ramallah Friends School, Shadi, who was arrested, falsely arrested. In fact, the person who made the claims has recanted them now, for throwing stones at a passing Israeli car. He was arrested and has been in military courts for more than a year now under house arrest. He's a teenager. It's a terrible story. So his family lives in Beit Hanina, which is a suburb of Jerusalem. He goes to school in Ramallah to the Friends School, and the kid's been under house arrest. And the thing to note is that if you are an Israeli, a Jewish Israeli, you are governed by the civil court system inside Israel. If you are a Palestinian, you are governed by the military court system. And there's notable differences in what that means in terms of the level of protection you have, what it means for having you can be detained without charges, the way you're treated, how long you are detained, how long the process takes, the kind of punishment that happens as a result of whatever indictment happens. So systemic oppression is certainly, that criteria has been met, and no doubt about it in Gaza, where every system is controlled by the Israeli government from outside of the borders. Inhumane acts, lots of pieces of that shown in the video, restrictions of movement, land confiscation, forcible transfer of people, things, and property, denial of residency rights, and an almost complete suspension of civil rights, as I talked about with military rule, and an inability to carry out most kinds of civil rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the criminalization of people gathered to participate in what Israel calls itself a democracy. So naming apartheid can be really uncomfortable here, just to say that, right? May not be for most of the folks in the room, but I think for a lot of people who feel squeamish about what felt like very clear, black and white, quite literally frameworks around apartheid in South Africa, there's a nervousness here, and there is a nervousness that gets wrapped up in a frankly very unsophisticated understanding of anti-Semitism too. So really what this campaign does, the Apartheid-Free campaign, and what movements are doing, generally speaking, in moving from a framework of looking at occupation as the problem to looking at apartheid as the problem. That's a notable shift in framing, that this isn't a temporary problem of occupation, as the person who heads B'Tselem said, no, I think he used the word normal. It's not necessarily the word I'd use, but nobody believes that 54 years is temporary. So that framing of occupation, which can be often a temporary framing under international law, is intended to be a temporary framing. Occupation is allowed under international law, but it is intended to be temporary. And there are enormous guidelines and laws that are supposed to be used as the framework for occupation that have not actually ever been used here either. But in any case, there is a growing consensus in the international community that what we're really talking about here is an apartheid framework, settler colonialism and apartheid. And there have been, so Human Rights Watch came out in a little more than 2 years ago and named this as apartheid. And since then, Amnesty International, Yesh Din, and B'Tselem, another international organization, 2 other Israeli human rights organizations. So two international, 2 Israeli human rights organizations have named this system as apartheid, as has Al-Haq, which is a Palestinian human rights organization. So the campaign to pledge to become an apartheid-free congregation or an apartheid-free community. There are communities that have joined. There are faith groups that have joined. There are even some individuals who are taking the pledge. We started the campaign. We had an early launch, a soft launch in June for the campaign, and we wanted to have 50 signers to it. We had 80 before we could even announce it. There's I think about 140 now, and we have asked congregations around the U.S. to pledge to be apartheid free. And the apartheid framing is really to resist racism and apartheid everywhere, and in particular, to withdraw support for Israeli apartheid. So apartheid, the pledge itself, here's what the pledge looks like. We affirm our commitment to freedom, justice, and equity for the Palestinian people, for the Palestinian people and all people. We oppose all forms of racism, bigotry, discrimination, and oppression, and we declare ourselves an apartheid-free community or congregation. And to that end, we've pledged to join others in working to end all support to Israel's apartheid regime, settler colonialism, and military occupation. That's the basis of the pledge. It's pretty simple and straightforward. And you may ask yourself why? Why should we take this pledge? And it's really a solidarity pledge, to be in solidarity with Palestinian civil society, Palestinian Christian groups who have called for the international community to join this campaign. They've asked for international support as they seek liberation. I noticed in the introductions, there are many people on this call who have been a part of support for Palestinian equality and liberation for a number of years in this group. And I think you can count this as sort of the next framing for how justice movements can approach work in support of justice for Palestinians. And part of that is really clearly naming that what we're talking about here is apartheid, and being explicit about that and as an act of solidarity. And why should your congregation take this pledge? And so what is, we have a special responsibility as faith communities in the US, both because there are an enormous number of faith communities in the US who are actively doing harm through either Christian Zionist work or direct support for the state of Israel. Sometimes those things are connected. And so there's a lot being done in the name of faith communities that actually harms Palestinians. So this is an opportunity for faith communities to step up in a way that offers some support. And also congregations played a key role in naming South African apartheid. So that strategy to end apartheid in South Africa had enormous support from interfaith movements and congregations around the US. And we can play a similar role in naming the realities for Palestine and Israel today. So lots of faith groups have already joined this. Individual congregations have joined from many different denominations: Quaker, Mennonite, Catholics, Buddhists, United Methodists, UCC, Jews, Buddhists, Episcopals, Muslims, Presbyterians, ecumenical groups, and interfaith groups have all taken the pledge so far. And the United Church of Christ as a full denomination has taken the pledge, a full denomination. And it's important to know that just this past week, in fact, I think 2 days ago, the Disciples of Christ passed a resolution at their general conference meeting in Louisville naming apartheid. That's huge. The Presbyterians did it in February of this year as well. That is a huge move, that denominations are naming this as apartheid, not just congregations. And the Rabbinic Council of Jewish Voices for Peace affirmed this apartheid frame also in earlier this year. So, the campaign is actually, there's a number of resources that are on the campaign website, which is apartheid-free.org. I will put that in the chat of the meeting in just a little bit. And encourage you to really take a look at that website. There are a lot of resources. Many of the links that I'm going to show in the following slides are, you can find the information really linked on apartheid-free.org. So there's opportunities, if anybody is in pastoral positions, for things that you can do during the liturgical year. And that sort of help highlight both the situation for Palestinians and the framing of apartheid. You can read the Kairos Palestine document, which is actually a call from Palestinian churches to Christian communities around the world to act. There's a lot of educational opportunities. I think I showed you that video intentionally. It's 12 minutes. It's super friendly to be able to invite people into the conversation about what the realities are. It's short enough to be able to show in lots of different venues. It's a good educational resource. There's lots of other resources that are linked on this website as well. So it's really an opportunity for individuals, community groups, congregations to educate themselves and to share that information to become good advocates. So take the pledge and then live the pledge, right? So you can take the pledge saying that you agree to be an apartheid-free community and then live it by actually doing some advocacy work on behalf of these issues, by talking about what US foreign aid to Israel actually looks like on the ground, the impact it has, to support calls from Palestinian civil and faith societies to act in ways that advocate for change. Again, this website, lots of educational materials. There are legal briefs that you can take a look at that actually lay out the case for apartheid. There's a bunch of shareable graphics, videos, some speakers you can invite in. And some things you could do, right? You could send press releases about the fact that you have become an apartheid-free community, which makes it plain that this framing is out there now. You can publicize those commitments. This is a public act, right? To name this and to be in support of a change for how the Israeli state operates and the way that it oppresses Palestinians. You can engage in advocacy, and I think there are a number of particular campaigns that I can recommend here, different organizations to check out. So the AFSC website is always a good place to go. Churches for Middle East Peace, which I think a number of you probably know about. CMAP also has action alerts and advocacy days for lobbying work that can be done. There's a campaign called No Way to Treat a Child, which is a bill to end the ill treatment of Palestinian children who live in military who are confined in the military detention system. As I talked about earlier, Palestinians do not have, I'll say, the luxury of being part of the civil, criminal, and trial systems inside Israel, and U.S. funding actually supports that the military courts that confine children and detain them for long periods of time, children, as young children. So Jewish Voice for Peace has action alerts, Americans for Justice in Palestine. There are also advocacy efforts that you all know about from the organizations that you work with that you named in your introduction today. More kinds of things you can do to be active, to be creative, to be public in your framing of this for, as I said, being an apartheid-free congregation or community is a public act. So I am gonna, let me stop sharing. I'm gonna end this presentation here. Let me just take a look into the chat here because some stuff came up. I do have a link to the video and we'll share it. I can send it to Rick after. Does that work, Rick?
Yes, that'd be great.
Okay, I'll send a link to that video.
Sonia, is the video itself on apartheidfree.org?
I don't know whether the video itself is on apartheidfree.org. I will. I'll ask the person who manages the website, but I'll send both the apartheidfree.org link and the link to the video, which is on YouTube actually. So very accessible. I'll send both of those things to Rick. I'll send a few web links to Rick afterwards so he can share with the larger group. So
and, what I'll do with those too is we do a YouTube video of this forum, and I can add them into the links to those in the descriptions as well.
Great to know. Good. Thanks. So, I gave you a kind of framework in that presentation for kind of, what is apartheid? Why is Israel an apartheid state, and what it is you can do as a public act of witness and solidarity and advocacy in relation to that apartheid. And I'll say, as I've mentioned a couple of times, I participated in this delegation. I've been to Palestine and Israel a number of times before, and always met with people who were peace activists people who were looking for, solidarity support, and met with people who were, on the receiving end of the dangers of occupation. And in this particular case, we also met with a bunch of folks who helped do the kind of like legal framework for, so why, what is the difference between occupation and apartheid, and why does it matter? And went to a city that I thought I'd never been to before, called Lod, depending on which language you speak, which is a mixed city inside Israel. So there are Jewish cities inside Israel, there are inside the Green Line. There are Jewish cities, there are Palestinian cities, and then there are some number of mixed cities. And I think I had never knowingly been inside a mixed city before. I hadn't really understood that frame before. And we met with a woman who took us on a little tour around Lid, and she is an urban planner by training. That is her training. And I never really like had the kind of a view of a town through the eyes of an urban planner. And it was fascinating and really disturbing, because it really was looking at the different levels of any kind of city planning that goes in. So the city, while mixed, still has very, it's still separated in a lot of ways. There are areas where Palestinians live, areas where Israeli Jews live. Inside Israel, that language, which I have to say, frankly, made me a little bit uncomfortable. I kept stumbling up against the fact that I was naming people as Jews. As I said, I grew up in a family, of Jews, right? Jews and Muslims. And so naming people as Jews was a real stumbling block for me in terms of language. And I think because I've worked on Palestine for so long, I've been really cognizant of naming the state of Israel and not naming Jews, right? Like, and that has a kind of sticks into my mouth a little bit feel to it around a sensitivity, my own sensitivity around anti-Semitism. But actually there is a reality that is what people inside Israel say. They talk about Jews and Palestinians, Israeli Jews and Palestinians, inside 48, inside the Green Line. And that's the distinction, because, and that distinction comes with a whole lot of meaning. And that meaning there's a legal distinctions between access that you have, services that you get, the level of urban planning that exists in the Jewish part of a mixed city versus the Palestinian part of a mixed city. It is a notable difference visually and structurally in the city between where Palestinians live and where Israelis live, that is based on the level of investment by the city in different parts of the city, including whether the police will respond to calls. I really had not understood that. I hadn't understood. Most of my look at occupation had been the West Bank and Gaza, both places I have spent a fair amount of time. I had not spent that much time inside Israel really examining what does it mean to be a Palestinian citizen of Israel and to have unequal access, unequal treatment, unequal ability to get a building permit to build a home. And so the level of insecurity that you live with because your home is on a demolition list, which, by the way, you then have to pay for. If the state demolishes your home, you are responsible for paying for that demolition. You can do it yourself, or you have the privilege of being able to demolish your own home, or the state will do it for you and bill you. So I will say I walked out of this most recent trip with a really different sort of understanding of beyond occupation. What does colonialism look like, even inside states where people have citizenship, but they don't have equal access, right? They don't have they don't benefit equally from the state. They have very different levels of support. Every level of treatment for investment in Palestinians inside Israel is different than it is for Jewish Israelis. And I was really struck by that in a very different way than all of the, as I said, I worked on this issue for 35 years. It was a really different framing for me. And I think the situation has really changed quite a lot. So I'll end my remarks there and open the space for questions. I see Steve and then Fernando have their hands up. So let's start with Steve.
Sonia, thank you so much. Jam-packed with information. I think it helps so many of us kind of gather our thoughts and organize them, which are often very disparate and anecdotal. So this is very important work, and I will raise my hand a second time because I'm going to invite a motion from our board of directors regarding the campaign. But my question, because you are among friends, you are among so many allies, but maybe it's my legal background to ask, what are the myths and arguments against calling Israel an apartheid state? I think sometimes it sharpens our thinking on something to think of what others are saying in opposition, because you've made a powerful presentation. But I hear from people that we are singling out Israel with all of the oppressive governments around the world, that it is the only, quote, democracy in the Middle East. And maybe there are other myths and opposition, but if you take a few minutes, if you agree, can you address some of those arguments and any others that you're aware of?
Sure. So I guess I'll start, Steve, by saying that I am often asked, I think partly because I'm a Quaker and work for Quaker organizations, and there's this sort of idea that we are supposed to somehow play a bridging or balancing role, and I'd argue with that notion a little bit, but I also sort of feel like there's a little bit of danger in playing devil's advocate in conversations, mostly because I think the devil has enough advocacy in the room often. But I will say this, that I think that it is true that there are a number of governments around the world that are doing terrible things to populations inside their countries. There are not very many situations like Israel and Palestine where there is a very clear 55-year-old now occupation. But there really are very specific legal frameworks for what is happening inside Israel, and that the largest sensitivity, I'd say, is less around whether Israel meets, the kind of pushing back around whether Israel is actually, the state is actually kind of guilty of engaging in apartheid, and more a real squeamishness and sensitivity that I think many of us have around that notion of singling Israel out. And I think we have a particular responsibility to carefully frame that this is, there's actually, even on the Apartheid-Free website, there's the .org website, there's some stuff around anti-Semitism, right? Like how do you push back against the framing of this as anti-Semitic? And I think for those of us who have come from Jewish families, who have worked on this issue for a long time, that's always the big problem here, right? So nothing has changed in the framing of this is about the behavior of a state. It is not about the Jewish people. That is really the important framing here, that this is about the behavior of a government and the way that government acts, that many Jews, including the Rabbinic Council of the Jewish Voice for Peace and many other organizations have said is in some ways explicitly anti-Jewish, right? And so I think I'm not in a position to sort of give the counter argument on why this isn't apartheid, What I can tell you is it very clearly is apartheid, and why we would name Israel is, I think, there's a slide in the presentation that talks about the particular responsibility that people in the US have. And a lot of that is tied up in the amount of financial support that this government and that American congregations give to the state of Israel, not the people of Israel, the state of Israel. What is our responsibility as the supporters for that military government and the way that military government behaves as people who essentially pay for it? All right, so Fernando, you are up next. Unfortunately, Zoom doesn't give you a who put their hand up in what order list, but I think I'll go Fernando next. You're muted, Fernando.
Really, I really agree with you in many of your statements. It's really, a criminal institution by the Israel government. What they're doing with the Palestinian and so forth. It's clearly a violation of international law. And so forth. And I guess my question is that how can you at least clearly charge the Israel government in terms of its violation? It's really inhumane what they're doing, to the Palestinian people. I mean, it's nothing new to me. I mean, this thing has been going on for so long, and continue to do so, in terms of occupation and so forth, and so maybe my question is that can you make it stick that this is really a clear violation of human rights and international law? I just leave it on that.
Yeah, Fernando, I appreciate that, and I'll say this: it's there at this point. There's just not a lot of dispute that it's a violation of international law. That both and it is a lot of things, right? Like the occupation and the, as I said, occupation itself is not illegal under international law. The particulars of this occupation have been notably named as a violation of international law by the UN and many different international bodies, multilaterals, for decades. So there's just not a lot of dispute about that. You can make the charges stick, but what can you do about them, right? And so I do think that question, and Anthony put something in the chat about this kind of $3 billion of military aid to Israel every year. It's like, what you can do is cut off some of the funding. What power do we have as Americans, right? We have the power to do advocacy in the US that changes the behavior of our government, and we can offer support in a public witness sort of way globally. We cannot change the behavior of the Israeli government. We have very few levers to pull here, but one major lever we have to pull is the funding lever.
Sonia, I believe the next hand was Jeff Cooper.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, can you hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to say that it's not usually said, but it's really important to me. I lived for 4 years in Ramallah, working with Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and we talk about the arrest of children. That's almost always said accurately that they're tried in military courts. But what I actually saw on a regular basis was, and I mean, it's acknowledged, but it's not usually said, is that these children ages 12 to 17 are treated as adults in those courts. Okay, and Jewish children anywhere in historical Palestine, and when I say historical, I mean everything, Jewish children ages 12 to 17 are still treated as children. And I personally witnessed the military in the West Bank, especially in Ramallah, arresting 11-year-olds, children under 12, and treating them as if they were 12 to 17 years. And that makes it so you're dealing with the issue of the discrimination between Jewish children ages 12 to 17 and Palestinian children. And then what immense harm is being done mentally, because I also taught in the Friends School in Ramallah while I was doing all this. And you can see it in children who were arrested and then eventually released. I used to say it's not, they don't have PTSD, they have OTSD. It's not post, it's ongoing trauma that they're still feeling, and it manifests itself in so many different ways, especially the artwork and the bedwetting and the nightmares and the insomnia, and you could go on. And then also having some of our students being killed right there in Ramallah, and having their bodies, children being dumped outside the city. Well, there was a town then when I lived there. Anyway, thank you. I just wanted to point out it's important that you see that they're treated as adults. And
it's huge. So Jeff, I recommend that you look up the No Way to Treat a Child campaign. To Google that, and there's some advocacy actions you can take related to exactly what you're talking about, because the impact of what you're talking about, that level of trauma that young people in Palestine for generations, for decades have been living with, is it's remarkable. And the idea that that people can actually go on and have in any way, a normal life after having survived a childhood like that is pretty remarkable. So a couple of things to look up. Shadi Khoury, I put his name in the chat, is the case I talked about. And he is a student at the Friends School, by the way. To look up Shadi's case, and to see what's happening with Shadi, and then the No Way to Treat a Child campaign. Both of those things. Rick, you have your...
We've been working the Justice for Palestinians in LA. We've been working by going to see our different Congress people in the area, in the districts we live in, and talking to them about supporting HR 3103. Betty McCollum's.
That's what. So McCollum's bill actually grew out of the No Way to Treat a Child campaign. So that's fantastic. Great.
Thank you very much.
Good to hear that. Thank you, Rick.
I really appreciate the information that you've been able to give, Sonia. And, I've given reflections here on different aspects of how language affects me. Things like portmanteaus, things like, different ways that we use language. And I think it's interesting to just think about the word apartheid, because it is a word that comes from the Boer language, which is a Dutch Creole almost of different languages. And it is a portmanteau in that language of two words, apart and hate. And in that specific word, we've kind of taken away the effect that it was created to achieve, especially in some place like South Africa, where this was a state-run action of expressing the hate they had for the indigenous people there and the political solutions that they came up with to express those actions. And I really think that one of the things that, especially in this apartheid-free movement in Palestine, is to actually show, dislike for the people that were originally there on that land to begin with. And I think if that's made more clear, people understand what the issue is. I just think it's so sad that in the early 1900s that there wasn't a way to, with people like Ben Gurion and other people that created the state of Israel, that there wasn't a way to look at living in harmony first above everything else. But yeah, I think the word apartheid is something that is very strong and very notable, and it's something that I think needs to be defined in order for people to understand what it actually means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I didn't actually know the etymology of the word there. So I appreciate that. Anthony.
Again, great presentation. I'm so glad you shared it with us. Excuse me. You haven't really talked much about the reaction in Israel to this apartheid-free campaign. Is the Israeli peace movement supportive of this campaign in some ways? And how do people in Israel react to it?
It's a good question. We met with a number of different Israeli peace groups while we were there, who lived very decidedly on the Israeli left. Also, remember, it's a particularly interesting time for internal politics in Israel because the move to essentially strip the power of the judiciary has happened by the prime minister. The incredibly right-wing government and prime minister has come in. And so there's a lot of activity going on by the Israeli left right now about their own sort of civil issues, right? I think the Israeli politics are fascinating. If anybody has paid attention to them, internal Israeli politics are fascinating, both because of, I think it's long been the case that American Jews had a much more difficult time talking about Palestinians and the occupation than, and even progressive and peace activist American Jews had a much more difficult time talking about it than Israelis themselves did. But what's happened more recently in Israel is the move of their government to be more right-wing, some naming of actual fascism, sort of the kinds of that what we've seen around the movement of governments around the world, the sort of Trump phenomenon happening in lots of places, right? So we met with an Israeli left that was pretty fired up while we were there. Some of the largest demonstrations that had ever happened in Israel, it happened just before we arrived. And so it was a group of people who were pretty fired up about the state of their own government. And the folks, particularly the folks who have kind of lived on the hard left inside Israel related to occupation, are very comfortable with this framing of apartheid. They appreciate it. I'm trying to think if we met with anybody who flat out said, like, don't call it that. And I don't think we did meet with anybody. Interestingly, Yesh Din and B'Tselem, as the two big Israeli human rights organizations, who both have pretty big audiences among peace activists on in the left in Israel, have been pretty direct. And in fact, the main narrator through that video that you saw was the former executive director of B'Tselem. So, I think that people are uncomfortable, right? It's an uncomfortable thing to name yourself as living in an apartheid state. And it is also, I think that the folks that we met with, peace activists and people on the left in Israel, Israeli Jews, again, that's just super hard language for me to use, but it is language they use. So, they're understanding that framework and trying to work within it. We heard a lot of people on the Israeli left talk about settler colonialism. That is language that is also really being used. It's also included in some of the language of the pledge. It's occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid. And this notion of settler colonialism, of people who have come from the outside, as Rick said, and essentially colonized land, and the behavior of those colonists, right? So Anthony, the answer to your question is, I think nobody loves to be, to have citizenship in a state that's doing terrible things. But we met with folks in the peace movement and on the left who were understanding that was the right term.
I see that Randy Heinlam had his hand up and now does not. Is that a mistake, Randy?
No, it wasn't a mistake. What I did was I put in my comment into the chat. If people are uncomfortable with the word apartheid, and of course, as was pointed out, this is a Boer term that applied specifically to South Africa, then I suggest if you people want to do something different, use the word that's used in Israel itself, which is hafrada, which literally means separation. And so in that sense, it has a very close equivalent to the Afrikaans or Boer word of apartheid. And my comment is in there. That was taken from a website, the AARPI website, which offers that definition. And I think, you know, we have to get past the semantics of this to say, well, what are the actions? And this is one thing that Sonia pointed out, is the actions meet the definition of the international definition of apartheid. So whether you want to use the word or not, the action is continuing.
Thank you, Randy. Steve.
Wanted to make a few comments that link this to us. Rabbi Leonard Bierman was one of our founders, and if I have this right, he presented a Nation magazine award to former President Jimmy Carter because of Carter's views on Israel. And Leonard Bierman called Israel an apartheid state. It was early in this conversation. It was courageous, as Leonard Bierman was always courageous, and he is of beloved memory to us for so many reasons. Secondly, what's happening in Israel today reminds me of the poem by the Reverend Martin Niemöller, because first they came for the Palestinians, and now people in Israel are up in arms that the government of Israel is exercising its repressive powers against Israelis. As it transforms its Supreme Court, denies the rule of law and accountability, and paves the way to excuse Bibi Netanyahu for his crimes. So all of a sudden, Israelis have woken up to this oppression, and that's the power of Niemöller's poem. Was he went from labor and the Jews, and now they came for us, and nobody was left to speak up. So I think we have to make more of that. At this moment, I am calling a special meeting of the Board of Directors of ICUJP. We have a quorum present, and I would invite a motion for ICUJP to take the Apartheid-Free Communities pledge, to add our name, and more than all that, to actively support the community pledge. This is only open to members of the Board of Directors for the next few moments. So may I have that motion from a member?
I so move.
Dave Clemens.
I second the move.
Who was that? That was Phil Way.
Phil
Me,
Way.
I second it.
Great, of course. So that is unanimous, Sonia.
Yay.
You had us at good morning, but it's because ICUJP itself has gone through something of a transformation or a dedication to this issue. We lost some Jews and some rabbis early in ICUJP's life over our support for Palestinian rights. We want to welcome them back, but we will always stand by principle. And Rick, if you would take the steps to add ICUJP to the apartheidfree.org website. And when we push out this video and our social media that Rick has been so adept at, I think we should find some of the action items on that site to encourage. We are really a coalition of congregations. We are an interfaith group. And by doing this, we can ask many of the members, more than there are present today, to study and, as warranted, take the Apartheid-Free Community Pledge. So your morning was worth it.
Well, I'm super grateful for your passing the resolution to join the pledge or motion. I'm not sure what language you used. Really grateful for that, and I hope you find it a rewarding, if challenging, thing to be public about. And I have to say, Steve, I really appreciated your reference to Leonard Bierman, who, when I was a young activist working in Los Angeles, I worked some with Leonard Bierman, and he was an amazing, inspirational character. Yeah. And Rabbi Bierman and Jimmy Carter were among the first. Jimmy Carter was really among the first people to name this as apartheid, and it's taken 25 years, longer than that actually, to catch up. So many thanks, folks. Phil, you have your hand up. I don't know if that's a question for me or something for the rest of the group.
Talking to me?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Your hand is up.
I see that. I did that. The idea of settler colonialism is very much at the root of this problem, this situation. The state of Israel was created specifically to provide settler colonialism from Eastern Europe, Eastern Jews, Middle European Jews. That was its purpose. And it was also clear the whole Zionist concept was clear, that the creation of the state of Israel was just for Jews. And those are the fundamental foundations of the problem we have today. With regard to settler colonialism, the Western world was waving hurrah at the creation of Israel because of the Holocaust reaction. And it took a very long time for progressive Americans to realize that they were supporting basically a Zionist settler colonialism, and that this was really not what they wanted to do. And I remember I was alive in 1948. I was there, and the progressive community that I grew up in with was hurrah for Israel. And I don't know when that began to change, but it has changed, obviously. The thing about the Western world, the Western democracies, whatever you want to call them, created that situation because they were so anxious to provide some kind of respite for the Eastern European Jews. And they created the state of Israel out of the Ottoman Empire, which was a Western controlled colonial enterprise in the first place. So we basically gave the Israelis a piece of land that really wasn't ours, and with our blessings. And just kind of offering this up as a perspective that Western democracies are complicit the creation of this system. So I'll
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, Phil, there's a couple of things that I just sort of feel really compelled to say here. One is that the creation of the state of Israel, where it was created, not the notion of the creation of a state, but the creation of the state of Israel, where it was created, is like the ultimate act of NIMBYism. That notion of not in my backyard, NIMBY, it's the ultimate act of NIMBYism, because there were Jewish refugees who were literally floating on the ocean looking for a place to go and being turned away by governments around the world. So the level of anti-Semitism that was in play in the creation of the state of Israel is notable. And it's also the case that there's all of this language that got kind of these catchphrases like people for a land in a land without people, which completely erased Palestinians and others who were actually living in what became the state of Israel. And this notion that sort of like everybody got to feel good about the creation of Israel was a lot about yeah, vaguely this idea that there should be a safe place for Jews to be, but let it be over there. Like, not where that there's so much anti-Semitism buried in the notion of the creation of the state and where it was built, which is, very much about what was happening at the time with after the British Mandate, right? Or it was still British Mandate territory then. So there's just so much that is like really deeply problematic for Jews in how it happened. And I will say my great grandparents were. I didn't understand this as a kid, but I learned later based on timing. My great grandparents moved from Eastern Europe to Palestine in the late 1800s, in like 1890. My grandfather, my maternal Jewish grandfather, was born in Jerusalem. And what I came to understand, they're buried in the Mount of Olives Cemetery, which is like Zionist, high ground for early Zionist settlers, right? Like I didn't understand. I don't think that we have language. We don't have a framework for what Zionism looked like at the time, right? It wasn't just this sort of notion of creating there was an intentional Zionist movement that was already happening 50 years before the creation of the state of Israel. So, it's like the stories that we tell ourselves about what happened are, often those carry more weight than the actual data about what happened, the facts of what happened. But I think there is just a lot that is super problematic for Jewish people themselves, ourselves, about the behavior of the state and the forming of the state, and this notion of a place that is for the Jews only, that was built on a place that pre-existed and had people who were not Jewish to begin with. That so much of this really just goes back to the founding of the state, and it's so wrapped up in all of these feelings we have, all of this sort of like guilt that people carry about what has happened to Jews for many, many, many generations. It predates the Holocaust for sure. So anyway. I think we end soon, right? So there was a question in the chat that I just want to briefly answer about kind of leaving you with a couple of suggestions. And I think the concrete suggestions that I would leave you with are really about particular actions you can take. So, for example, supporting, as Jeff talked about, that House resolution that McCollum has introduced around child detention. And you can do legislative advocacy visits that are about US funding and US military aid to Israel. And you can come at this from the perspective of like, what are we talking about here in terms of the role that US funding plays, that our government plays in the oppression of people and the furthering of, war, because that is actually what's happening there. You cannot go there and experience this apartheid frame and occupation and not understand it as war. It is a highly militarized place, and we are paying for quite a lot of that militarization. And I think I will end there.